two kingdoms stood shoulder to shoulder against annihilation. For generations they had rivaled each other, competing for trade routes, border fortresses, influence over lesser lords. But when the northern invasion came like a winter storm that devoured cities whole, rivalry became irrelevance. Survival demanded unity. The invaders did not negotiate. They burned fields before harvest, salted wells, and left border towns as warnings. Refugees flooded south with stories of iron phalanxes and siege engines that never seemed to tire. Alone, either kingdom could withstand the tide. Together, they believed they could break it. Their rulers met beneath vaulted stone, not as enemies but as men aware that history was watching. Nobles lined the chamber. Generals stood in polished armor still scarred from frontier skirmishes. Between the two thrones lay an ancient parchment retrieved from royal archives, an old wartime covenant drafted centuries ago after a betrayal nearly destroyed them both. It was not a simple alliance agreement. It was absolute. If one kingdom abandoned the other in active battle, if it withdrew promised forces or deliberately sabotaged the field, the injured party would inherit all lands, titles, treasuries, fleets, and noble holdings of the betrayer under sacred law. No debate. No negotiation. Total forfeiture. The clause was called the Blood Oath. It had never been invoked. Most believed it never would be. Its existence was meant to guarantee loyalty through fear of consequence. It was a chain forged not of trust, but of accountability. Both rulers signed. Seals were pressed into wax before witnesses. High priests marked the covenant with ceremonial rites binding crown to consequence. The hall echoed with approval as soldiers outside cheered the news of unity. Two banners would march as one. Two armies would strike as a single blade. The strategy was clear. The southern kingdom would hold the center line with its disciplined infantry, shield walls trained to absorb punishment. The eastern kingdom would deploy its elite cavalry, the finest heavy riders in the region, to execute a decisive flanking charge once the enemy committed its main force. Timing would decide everything. Confidence spread through the ranks. Supply chains were merged. Scouts exchanged intelligence. Commanders drilled together to eliminate hesitation on the field. Differences in dialect and custom faded in the face of shared purpose. The invasion army advanced regardless, columns stretching across the horizon like moving iron forests. Smoke from ruined settlements trailed behind them. They expected divided opposition. They would face unity instead. On the eve of battle, campfires stretched for miles. Soldiers sharpened blades and spoke of home. Messengers rode between Allied command tents carrying final confirmations of formation and signal codes. Trumpets would sound once the enemy overextended. The cavalry would ride at that moment. The maneuver had been rehearsed in theory a dozen times. The kings addressed their troops separately but with identical promises: hold the line, trust the plan, protect one another. Victory would not belong to one crown. It would belong to both, or neither would survive to wear one. At dawn, banners rose side by side. The battlefield chosen was a broad plain framed by low ridges, open enough for cavalry dominance, firm enough to support infantry formations. It was terrain selected precisely to maximize the alliance's strengths. Every detail favored coordination. There were no visible cracks in the partnership. No public hesitation. Supplies had been delivered as agreed. Forces had arrived at full strength. The cavalry camps the night before were full, horses restless and armored riders prepared. Trust was not blind. It was reinforced by law, by oath, by shared peril. As the armies formed ranks under a cold sky, the blood oath lay locked in the royal archive miles away, silent but absolute. It represented more than punishment. It represented certainty. Betrayal would cost everything. No one believed it would ever need to be opened. They marched forward convinced that unity would decide the war. They did not yet know that unity was already broken. Steel met steel before the sun reached its height. The invading host advanced in dense formation, shields overlapping, pikes angled like a moving wall of thorns. Drums thundered across the plain. The Allied center held firm, infantry locking shields exactly as planned. Arrows darkened the air. The first clash shook the ground. The strategy depended on patience. The southern kingdom's infantry absorbed the initial assault with brutal discipline. Front ranks fell and were replaced without hesitation. Officers barked commands through smoke and dust. Every heartbeat bought time for the decisive maneuver that would break the enemy's momentum. Behind the ridgeline to the east, the Allied cavalry waited. Thousands of armored riders. Warhorses trained to crash through formations. Their charge was the hammer meant to shatter the invading anvil. The signal fire rose. A column of black smoke spiraled into the sky, the prearranged command for the cavalry to advance. The infantry tightened formation, bracing for the moment the enemy flank would collapse under thunderous impact. Minutes passed. No horns sounded from the eastern ridge. The enemy pressed harder, sensing strain in the line. Casualties mounted. Shields splintered. Blood soaked into churned soil. Captains sent riders to confirm timing. The riders did not return. A second signal flare ignited, brighter and urgent. Still no cavalry. Scouts emerged from the eastern flank at full gallop, faces pale beneath dust. Their words spread like frost through command ranks. The Allied banners were retreating. The cavalry columns had turned away from the field. Not repositioning. Withdrawing. Confusion struck first. Then disbelief. Then clarity. The enemy commander saw the gap forming before anyone else did. He shifted reserves toward the exposed flank. What was meant to be a coordinated strike became a widening vulnerability. Without cavalry pressure, the invaders enveloped the Allied infantry from the side. The center line bent but did not break. Soldiers fought knowing reinforcement would not come. Units cut off from retreat chose to stand rather than scatter. Officers reorganized fragmented formations into defensive knots, rotating wounded backward while holding ground inch by inch. Every movement shifted from offense to survival. The king of the southern realm rode along the rear ranks, refusing evacuation. He ordered controlled fallback towards secondary positions mapped before the battle began. Contingency plans once considered unlikely were executed with precision. Bridges were burned in sequence. Supply wagons rerouted. Archers redeployed to elevated ground to slow pursuit. The cost was staggering. Thousands fell covering the withdrawal. Entire companies disappeared buying minutes. Standard bearers planted torn flags into blood-soaked earth as rally points until overrun. Yet annihilation did not come. Discipline replaced expectation. Rage replaced shock. What had been an alliance battle became a calculated fighting retreat. The invading army, overextended in pursuit, suffered its own losses pressing into fortified fallback lines prepared in advance. By nightfall, remnants of the Allied infantry held defensible high ground miles from the original field. They were diminished but intact. Command structure remained functional. Supply routes, though strained, were not severed. Messengers intercepted along the eastern roads told the rest of the story. Orders bearing the royal seal of the Allied king instructed immediate withdrawal at first engagement. No clause of repositioning. No contingency language. Clear, deliberate abandonment. It was not confusion. It was decision. The realization settled heavier than defeat. The battle had not been lost to superior strength alone. It had been tilted from within. Mass graves were dug under torchlight. Survivors counted regiments that would never answer roll again. Armor was stacked in silent rows beside the wounded. They had been left to die. But they had not died. And among captured dispatch riders and seized correspondence lay proof that the withdrawal was commanded before the first sword struck. The betrayal had been written in ink before it was written in blood. Survival ended speculation. Evidence began calculation. The captured dispatch riders were separated and questioned under formal military protocol. Their statements aligned without coercion. Withdrawal orders had been distributed to cavalry commanders before dawn. The justification cited: strategic preservation of assets. No emergency amendment. No battlefield reassessment. The decision had been made before contact. Sealed letters recovered from a fallen courier carried the Allied king's insignia impressed in unmistakable wax. The wording was precise: At the first signal of engagement, cavalry units were to disengage and return east under full formation. No conditional language. No reference to unforeseen developments. It was not hesitation. It was design. Surviving captains from the ridge confirmed they had watched the cavalry standard turn away as the signal fire rose. Trumpeters never sounded the charge. Riders maintained disciplined columns during retreat, not chaotic flight. The maneuver was orderly because it was planned. The council convened within hours of confirmation. Generals demanded immediate retaliation. Younger nobles argued for direct invasion before the betrayer consolidated defenses. Grief sharpened every voice. Entire bloodlines had been extinguished on the plain. The king did not raise his voice. He ordered the archive opened. The ancient covenant was retrieved under armed guard. Its parchment was aged but intact, its seals preserved in hardened crimson wax. Legal scholars read aloud the clause no one expected to invoke. If either signatory abandoned the other in active battle, the injured party would inherit all lands, titles, treasuries, fleets, and noble estates of the betrayer under sacred wartime law. Enforcement required proof before witnesses of deliberate abandonment. Proof now existed. Testimony was documented formally. Seals on recovered letters were examined and verified by royal scribes familiar with every contour of the allied king's mark. Timeline reconstruction confirmed the withdrawal order preceded the first clash. Scouts' reports placed cavalry movement away from the field at the exact moment engagement began. The standard of evidence was met. Instead of marching east in fury, the king prepared a declaration. Messengers were dispatched not to mobilize invasion columns, but to summon clergy, neutral observers, and noble signatories who had witnessed the original pact. Copies of the recovered orders were transcribed. Survivor testimonies were recorded under oath. The chain of command was outlined in meticulous detail. By dusk the proclamation was drafted. It did not accuse. It did not threaten. It invoked. The blood oath clause was formally activated under the authority of surviving witnesses and binding covenant law. The declaration stated that deliberate abandonment had been proven through written command and corroborated testimony. Therefore, by the covenant's own terms, sovereignty over the betrayer's lands, holdings, treasuries, ports, fleets, and noble titles transferred immediately to the injured crown. Copies were sent to every major lord within both kingdoms. One sealed copy was delivered directly to the betrayer's capital. There would be no raid. No torching of villages. No chaotic revenge. There would be enforcement through legitimacy. Markets reacted first. Merchants halted transfers eastward, uncertain which authority would control ports within days. Minor nobles in the betrayer's realm reviewed their own signatures on the covenant and calculated risk. Military officers, aware that they had not been consulted in the withdrawal decision, began to question loyalty owed to a ruler who had violated sacred wartime law. The king addressed his council one final time that night. Steel would remain sheathed until resistance forced otherwise. The objective was not destruction. It was acquisition through lawful consequence. They had been betrayed in battle. Now the response would not be emotional. It would be absolute. The declaration moved faster than any army could. Before a single border was crossed, the mechanism of inheritance began turning. Copies of the invoked covenant reached merchant councils, port authorities, banking houses, and provincial governors across the betrayer's realm. Each document carried verified seals, witness signatures, and reproduced orders proving deliberate abandonment. The legality was not arguable. It was documented. Trade reacted immediately. Major guilds froze shipments bound for the Eastern Crown, citing uncertainty of sovereign authority. Credit lines were suspended. Caravans redirected towards southern markets where stability was now guaranteed by law. Coin exchangers began valuing currency based on the likelihood of imminent regime transfer. Nobles were the next to calculate. Every landed lord who had stood in the hall when the blood oath was signed understood the implications. Their estates, titles, and ancestral claims were bound to the covenant. If the clause held, their fealty shifted with sovereignty. Resistance meant forfeiture. Compliance meant retention under a new crown. Letters of conditional allegiance began arriving at the southern capital within days. Military commanders in the betrayer's army faced a sharper dilemma. They had not ordered the withdrawal. Many had lost kin on the frontier before the alliance was formed. When copies of the sealed retreat command circulated among officer ranks, confidence fractured. Loyalty to a ruler who gambled allied lives for calculated preservation weakened rapidly. Provincial garrisons declared neutrality pending legal resolution. The southern king advanced only after these fractures widened. Not in a wild march of conquest, but in organized columns accompanied by magistrates, record-keepers, and clergy empowered to formalize transfers of authority. At each major city, the declaration was read publicly. The covenant was displayed. Witnesses confirmed authenticity. Gates opened without siege. Treasuries were inventoried, not looted. Harbor masters lowered one banner and raised another under supervision of local officials who retained their posts after swearing renewed oaths. Tax ledgers were secured. Grain stores catalogued. Administrative continuity was preserved to prevent chaos. The betrayer's capital stood isolated before a single blade was drawn against it. Inside its walls, the ruler who had ordered withdrawal expected retaliation through fire and blood. He prepared for invasion, not absorption. Appeals to rally loyalty were met with hesitation. His own nobles had already calculated survival under lawful transfer. His generals knew the covenant's wording as well as he did. When the southern delegation arrived, they did not demand surrender of a city. They presented the enforced inheritance. Under covenant law, sovereignty had shifted the moment abandonment was proven and invoked before witnesses. Resistance now constituted rebellion against recognized authority rather than defense of legitimate rule. The palace guard divided. Some removed their insignia voluntarily. Others stood down when informed their estates would be preserved under compliance. Isolation became undeniable. The ruler who believed no one would survive to testify faced the evidence laid before him, his own sealed command reproduced in careful script. He had expected battlefield erasure. Instead, survivors had carried proof. Authority transferred without sack or massacre. The crown was removed, titles dissolved, and the former king stripped of claim under the very pact he signed. No pyres burned. No cities fell. The conquest was administrative, complete, and irreversible. The fallen soldiers were honored in the newly unified realm with monuments funded from the absorbed treasury. Their sacrifice secured more than survival. It secured expansion through consequence. They had been betrayed in battle. They responded with memory, law, and unyielding resolve. Everything the betrayer owned now belonged to the ones he tried to abandon.